Father Antonio Mendez had built his entire life on absolute certainties. At 42 years old, he had served the Catholic Church for nearly 2 decades, rising through the ranks with unwavering dedication to traditional doctrine and conservative theology. His parish in the wealthy district of Buenos Aires was known for its strict adherence to canonical law, its immaculate ceremonies, and its pastor's reputation for delivering sermons that left no room for doubt or questioning. Antonio's certainty had been forged in the fires of his childhood. Growing up in a poor neighborhood where crime and desperation were daily realities, he had found salvation in the rigid structure of Catholic teaching. The Church had given him purpose, education, a clear path away from the violence that claimed so many of his childhood friends. In return, he had devoted himself completely to defending every doctrine, every tradition, every rule that had saved him from a life of poverty and meaninglessness. His parishioners respected him for his unwavering stance on moral issues. When families came to him with problems, Antonio provided clear answers based on church teaching. When young people questioned aspects of their faith, he guided them back to orthodox beliefs with patient but firm instruction. When social issues arose in the community, his response was always grounded in centuries of established doctrine. The announcement that Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio had been elected Pope Francis had initially filled Antonio with cautious optimism. Here was an Argentine, someone who understood the challenges of Latin American Catholicism, someone who had lived through the same social struggles that shaped Antonio's own worldview. Surely this pope would strengthen the Church's traditional positions and bring stability to what Antonio saw as an increasingly confused world. But as Pope Francis began his papacy, Antonio found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the Holy Father's approach. The Pope's emphasis on mercy over judgment, his focus on serving the poor over maintaining institutional authority, his willingness to engage with divorced Catholics, and his statements about welcoming marginalized communities all seemed to contradict the rigid certainties that it had defined Antonio's faith journey. Antonio's discomfort reached a breaking point when Pope Francis announced he would be visiting Buenos Aires for a special conference on pastoral care. The Vatican had specifically requested that local priests submit questions and concerns directly to the Pope during private sessions. Antonio saw this as an opportunity to voice his concerns about what he perceived as dangerous deviations from established church teaching. For weeks, Antonio prepared his questions meticulously. He researched canon law, compiled quotations from previous popes, and constructed careful arguments about the importance of maintaining doctrinal purity. His intention was not to challenge the Pope's authority, but to respectfully request clarification on positions that seemed to contradict centuries of established teaching. The day of the papal visit arrived with all the pageantry and excitement that such events generated. Buenos Aires buzzed with anticipation as thousands of faithful gathered to see the first Argentine pope return to his homeland. Antonio put on his best cassock, polished his cross until it gleamed, and made his way to the cathedral where the private sessions with clergy would take place. As he walked through the streets filled with celebrating crowds, Antonio felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He believed deeply that he was about to have a conversation that would either confirm his concerns about the direction of the Church or provide him with the clarity he needed to understand the Pope's, seemingly radical approach to ministry. The cathedral was packed with hundreds of priests, deacons, and religious sisters from across Argentina. Antonio found himself seated in the third row, close enough to see the Pope's expressions clearly when the Holy Father entered the ornate sanctuary. Pope Francis appeared smaller in person than Antonio had expected, but his presence filled the space with an energy that was both humble and commanding. After the opening prayers and formal presentations, Pope Francis surprised everyone by stepping away from the prepared podium and walking directly into the audience of clergy. "I want to hear your real questions," he said with a smile that seemed to reach every person in the cathedral. "It's not the questions you think you should ask, but the ones that keep you awake at night." Antonio felt his carefully prepared notes suddenly seem inadequate. This was not the formal theological discussion he had anticipated. But when the Pope's eyes met his directly, and the Holy Father nodded in his direction, Antonio stood and cleared his throat. "Your Holiness," Antonio began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Many of us are struggling to understand how we can maintain the integrity of church doctrine while also embracing some of the pastoral approaches you have advocated. How do we balance truth with mercy when they seem to conflict? The question hung in the air of the cathedral, and Antonio could feel hundreds of eyes upon him. He had voiced what many of his colleagues were thinking, but had been afraid to ask. Directly, Pope Francis studied Antonio's face for what felt like an eternity, his expression neither critical nor approving, but deeply thoughtful. "What is your name, Father?" Pope Francis asked gently. "Father Antonio Mendez, Your Holiness. I serve at San Miguel Parish." Pope Francis nodded slowly. "Father Antonio, tell me about the last person you turned away from your church." The question hit Antonio like a physical blow. He had expected a theological discussion, a clarification of doctrine, an explanation of papal policy. Instead, he found himself facing a question that pierced straight to the heart of his ministry and his understanding of what it meant to serve God. Antonio's mind raced through recent months, searching for an answer to Pope Francis's unexpected question. The silence in the cathedral seemed to stretch endlessly as hundreds of clergy waited to hear his response. Finally, a memory surfaced that made his stomach tighten with discomfort. "There was a woman," Antonio said quietly, his voice barely carrying beyond the first few rows. "About 6 weeks ago. She came to me requesting communion, but she was living with a man outside of marriage. She had been divorced and remarried without an annulment. I explained to her that she could not receive the sacraments until she regularized her situation according to church law." Pope Francis listened without interruption, his face betraying no emotion. When Antonio finished, the Pope asked simply, "Did you ask her why she came to you?" Antonio felt defensive. "Your Holiness, her situation was clear. Canon law is explicit about these matters. I was upholding the teaching of the Church." "But did you ask her why she came to you?" Pope Francis repeated, his voice gentle but insistent. "I know, Your Holiness." The canonical issues were the priority. Pope Francis walked closer to Antonio, close enough that their conversation became intimate despite the presence of hundreds of witnesses. "Father Antonio, when people come to our churches, they are not bringing us their successes. They are bringing us their wounds, their struggles, their desperate need for healing. This woman walked through your doors not because her life was perfect, but because it was broken and she needed God's mercy." Antonio felt his carefully constructed theological framework beginning to tremble. "But Your Holiness, surely we cannot simply ignore church teaching. We allow exceptions to doctrine. Where does it end? How do we maintain the integrity of our faith?" The Pope's response came in the form of another story. "When I was a young priest in Buenos Aires, a man came to me who had not been to Mass in 20 years. He was addicted to drugs, had spent time in prison, and was living on the streets. Asked me if God could forgive someone like him. Do you know what I told him, Father Antonio?" Antonio shook his head, feeling increasingly unsure of where this conversation was leading. "I told him that God had been waiting for him every single day of those 20 years. I told him that God's mercy was bigger than his mistakes, bigger than his failures, bigger than his shame. And then I asked him what he needed most in that moment." Pope Francis paused, allowing his words to settle over the assembly. He did not need a lecture about doctrine. He did not need to be reminded of his failures. He needed to know that he was loved unconditionally, that there was a place for him in God's family, despite everything he had done wrong. Antonio found himself thinking about the divorced woman who had come to his parish. He remembered her face, not defiant or careless, but tired and hopeful. She had walked into his church despite knowing that many priests would reject her. She had sought communion despite understanding the obstacles in her path. "Your Holiness," Antonio said, his voice now uncertain, "are you suggesting that we should ignore canonical requirements?" Pope Francis smiled, but it was not a dismissive smile. It was the patient expression of a teacher helping a student work through a difficult concept. "Father Antonio, tell me about your own journey to the priesthood. What brought you to serve God?" The question shifted the conversation in a direction that made Antonio deeply uncomfortable. His path to priesthood was not a story of theological certainty, but one of desperation and salvation. He had become a priest because the church had rescued him from a life that seemed destined for tragedy. I was saved by the church, Antonio admitted. My family was poor, my neighborhood was dangerous, and I was heading toward a life of violence and crime. A parish priest saw something in me and offered me a different path. The structure and teaching of the church gave me purpose and direction. And did this priest who saved you, Pope Francis asked gently, did he first require you to prove your worthiness? Did he wait until you had perfect understanding of all church doctrine before he offered you God's love? Antonio felt tears forming in his eyes as he remembered Father Miguel, the elderly priest who had taken a chance on an angry, confused teenager from the barrio. Father Miguel had not demanded perfection. He had offered love, guidance, and opportunity to a young man who desperately needed all three. No, Antonio whispered. He welcomed me exactly as I was. Pope Francis nodded. And in welcoming you as you were, did Father Miguel weaken the church or strengthen it? The question hung in the air like incense, sacred and penetrating. Antonio realized that he was being forced to confront the fundamental contradiction in his approach to ministry. He had been saved by mercy, but was dispensing judgment. He had been welcomed in his brokenness, but was requiring perfection from others. Around the cathedral, Antonio could see other priests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This conversation was challenging more than just his personal beliefs. It was calling into question the pastoral approach that many of them had adopted. Your Holiness, another priest called out from across the cathedral, how do we balance mercy with maintaining moral standards? If we welcome everyone regardless of their situation, what message does that send about the importance of living? According to church teaching, Pope Francis turned to address the broader audience, but his words seemed directed specifically at Antonio. Dear brothers, we are not called to be customs officials checking papers at the border of God's kingdom. We are called to be shepherds, bringing lost sheep back to the fold. A shepherd does not ask a lost sheep to find its own way home. A shepherd goes out into the wilderness, finds the sheep wherever it is, and carries it back to safety. Antonio felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of his vocation. The certainties that had defined his priesthood for 20 years were being gently but persistently challenged by a vision of ministry that was both more demanding and more compassionate than anything he had previously considered. Pope Francis continued speaking, but now he addressed the entire assembly while maintaining eye contact with Antonio. I want to tell you about a phone call I received last month. A woman from Germany called the Vatican. Somehow she managed to get through to my office directly. She was crying so hard that my secretary could barely understand her. The cathedral fell into complete silence as everyone strained to hear the Pope's story. This woman told me that her teenage son had come out as gay and that their parish priest had told the family they were no longer welcome in the church unless the boy agreed to deny his identity and seek conversion therapy. The family was devastated. They had been active members of their parish for 15 years, but suddenly they were being told that God no longer had a place for them. Antonio felt his chest tighten. He had encountered similar situations in his own parish and had responded with what he believed was appropriate pastoral guidance based on church teaching. But hearing the Pope describe the pain of this family forced him to see his actions from a different perspective. Do you know what I told this mother? Pope Francis asked, his voice carrying both authority and tenderness. Antonio shook his head, along with dozens of other priests throughout the cathedral. I told her that God loves her son exactly as he is. I told her that their parish priest was wrong to turn them away, and that they should find a community that would welcome them with open arms. I told her that her son's sexual orientation does not change his status as a beloved child of God. A murmur rippled through the assembly. Some priests nodded in agreement, while others looked deeply troubled by the Pope's words. Antonio found himself somewhere in between, shocked by the directness of the Pope's statement but unable to ignore the compassion behind it. Your Holiness. An elderly priest from the back of the cathedral called out, surely you are not suggesting that we ignore church teaching on homosexuality? Pope Francis turned to face the questioner with patience that seemed infinite. Father, tell me what Jesus said about homosexuality. The elderly priest paused, clearly surprised by the question. Well, Your Holiness, there are passages in Scripture. Did Jesus say? Pope Francis repeated gently but firmly. After a long silence, The priest admitted, Jesus did not speak directly about homosexuality in the Gospels. That is correct, Pope Francis confirmed. But Jesus spoke constantly about love, about welcoming outcasts, about embracing those whom society had rejected. He ate with tax collectors and prostitutes. He touched lepers when touching them was forbidden. He showed mercy to adulterers when the law demanded punishment. Antonio felt his worldview continuing to shift beneath his feet. He had always focused on Paul's letters and Old Testament passages when dealing with questions of sexuality, but he had never seriously considered what the Pope was now highlighting, that Jesus himself had consistently chosen inclusion over exclusion. Your Holiness, Antonio heard himself saying, though he had not consciously decided to speak. If we follow this approach, how do we help people grow in holiness? How do we encourage them to live according to God's plan if we simply accept them as they are? Pope Francis smiled at Antonio with what appeared to be genuine affection. Father Antonio, you have asked the most important question of all. But let me ask you something in return. How many people have you helped grow in holiness by turning them away from the church? The question hit Antonio like a lightning bolt. In his 20 years of ministry, he could not think of a single person who had grown closer to God because he had refused them the sacraments or excluded them from church activities. In fact, most of the people he had turned away had simply stopped coming to church entirely. None, Antonio admitted quietly. And how many people grew in holiness because someone welcomed them despite their imperfections? Antonio thought about his own journey, about Father Miguel's patient guidance, about the countless people in his parish who had been transformed by experiencing unconditional love and acceptance. Many, he said, his voice barely audible. Pope Francis walked back toward Antonio, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. My brother, holiness is not a destination that people must reach before they can enter God's house. Holiness is a journey. That begins when people feel safe enough to bring their authentic selves into God's presence. The Pope paused, allowing his words to settle over the assembly. When we create conditions that force people to hide who they are, to pretend to be something they are not, to suppress their struggles and their questions, we do not create holiness. We create fear, shame, and distance from God. Antonio felt tears running down his cheeks as he recognized the truth in the Pope's words. Many people had he forced to wear masks in his presence. How many had pretended to be more perfect than they were because they feared his judgment? How many authentic relationships with God had been stunted because people believed they had to earn acceptance before they could seek transformation? Your Holiness, Antonio said, his voice shaking with emotion. I think I have been serving my own need for certainty more than I have been serving God's people. Pope Francis squeezed Antonio's shoulder gently. Father Antonio, the fact that you can recognize this shows that God is already working in your heart. Certainty can be a form of pride, a way of avoiding the difficult work of walking alongside people in their struggles. The Pope addressed the entire assembly again. My dear brothers and sisters, people do not need us to be perfect. They do not need us to have all the answers. They need us to be present with them in their questions, their doubts, their failures, and their hopes. They need us to love them the way God loves them, unconditionally, patiently, and with complete faith in their capacity for growth and transformation. Antonio realized that everything he had believed about effective ministry was being gently but thoroughly dismantled and rebuilt on a foundation of radical compassion that was both terrifying and liberating. As the formal session concluded, Pope Francis did something unprecedented. Instead of retiring to private quarters for rest, he announced that he would remain in the cathedral for individual conversations with any priest who wished to continue the discussion. Antonio found himself frozen in his seat as dozens of clergy either left the cathedral or formed small groups to process what they had just experienced. 20 minutes later, Antonio was one of only 15 priests remaining in the vast space. Pope Francis had dismissed his security detail and assistants, creating an intimate atmosphere despite the grandeur of their surroundings. He approached each remaining priest individually, engaging in quiet conversations that lasted several minutes. When the Pope reached Antonio, the younger priest felt simultaneously eager and terrified to continue their dialogue. Up close, Pope Francis appeared even more human, tired from the long day, but with eyes that seemed to hold infinite patience and understanding. "Father Antonio," the Pope said, settling into the pew beside him rather than maintaining the formal distance that protocol would normally require. "Tell me about the woman who came to you for communion. What do you know about her story beyond her marital status?" Antonio realized with shame that he knew almost nothing about her as a person. "Her name is Maria Santos. She has been attending my parish for about 2 months. She comes alone, sits in the back, participates in all the prayers and responses, but I focused only on her canonical situation when she approached me about receiving communion. And what do you imagine brought her to your church after what was probably years away from regular worship?" The question forced Antonio to consider possibilities he had never explored. I'd never asked. I assumed she was simply being casual. About church law, perhaps hoping I would not notice her situation or would choose to ignore it. Pope Francis shook his head gently. "Father, people do not return to the church lightly, especially when they know their situations are complicated. Something significant happened in Maria's life that made her feel she needed God's presence again. Your response to her request for communion was probably her first real test of whether the church would welcome her home or send her away again." Antonio felt a wave of regret wash over him. "I sent her away." "Yes, you did. But that does not mean her story is over or that your relationship with her cannot be redeemed." The Pope was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "Antonio, I want you to understand something important. When I speak about mercy and inclusion, I am not suggesting that we abandon moral teaching or that sin does not matter. I am suggesting that our approach to helping people grow in holiness must begin with love, not judgment." Antonio leaned forward, desperate to understand this balance between compassion and truth that the Pope was describing. "Your Holiness, how do we help people understand that their choices have consequences without making them feel rejected by God? Tell me about your own greatest failure as a priest," Pope Francis replied, once again deflecting the theoretical question toward personal experience. Antonio hesitated.
Oh.
But the Pope's patient expression encouraged honesty. "About 5 years ago, a teenage boy in my parish was struggling with drug addiction. His parents brought him to me repeatedly begging for help. I kept telling them that he needed to choose to change, that I could not help him until he demonstrated real commitment to sobriety. The boy died of an overdose 6 months later." The words hung in the air between them like a confession, heavy with regret and grief that Antonio had carried for years. "What do you wish you had done differently?" Pope Francis asked softly. "I wish I had walked alongside him instead of waiting for him to walk toward me. I wish I had met him where he was instead of demanding that he meet me where I thought he should be." Pope Francis nodded slowly. "And do you think your approach failed because you cared too much about his spiritual welfare, or because you cared too little?" The question pierced through Antonio's defenses. "I cared too little," he admitted. "I was more concerned with maintaining my position as a moral authority than I was with saving a child who was dying." "Oh. Now apply that same insight to Maria Santos. What was more important to you in that moment, upholding canonical regulations, or shepherding a soul who had found the courage to come home to God?" Antonio felt the last of his theological certainties crumble. "I was protecting the rules instead of protecting the person." Pope Francis placed a weathered hand on Antonio's shoulder. "The rules exist to serve love, not the other way around. When we use doctrine to build walls instead of bridges, we have forgotten the purpose of our calling." A silence settled between them that felt both comfortable and transformative. Finally, Antonio spoke again. "Your Holiness, if I embrace this approach, how do I explain it to my parishioners who expect clear moral guidance? How do I lead them if I am no longer certain about everything?" Pope Francis smiled, and for the first time since their conversation began, Antonio detected a hint of humor in the Pope's expression. "Father Antonio, has your certainty been serving your parishioners well?" Antonio thought about his parish. Faithful, well-behaved, but lacking the vibrant spiritual growth he saw in some other communities. "Honestly, no. My parish is very orderly, but I am not sure it is very alive." Perhaps what your parishioners need is not a priest who has all the answers, but a priest who is brave enough to ask better questions. Perhaps they need someone who models how to wrestle with difficult issues while maintaining faith in God's love. The Pope stood, indicating that their private conversation was drawing to a close. Antonio, I am going to ask you to do something that may be very difficult. I want you to find Maria Santos and ask her to tell you her story. Really listen to why she came back to the church and what she needs from God. Do not try to solve her problems or correct her situation. Just listen and let her know that she is welcome in God's house. Antonio felt both excited and terrified by this assignment. And then what? Then trust the Holy Spirit to guide both of you toward whatever growth and healing God has planned. Pope Francis walked away to speak with the remaining priests. Antonio sat alone in the magnificent cathedral, feeling as though his entire understanding of priesthood had been gently but thoroughly revolutionized. The man who had entered this conversation, absolutely certain about his duty to God, was leaving it with more questions than answers. But for the first time in years, the questions felt like invitations to deeper faith, rather than threats to be defended against. 3 days after his conversation with Pope Francis, Antonio found himself standing outside a small apartment building in one of Buenos Aires' middle-class neighborhoods. He had spent hours tracking down Maria Santos's address through parish records and gentle inquiries with neighbors who attended his church. Now, holding a small bouquet of flowers and carrying more nervousness than he had felt since his ordination, he knocked on her door. Maria answered after several moments, and her expression immediately shifted from curiosity to wariness when she recognized him. She was younger than Antonio had initially thought, probably in her early 30s, with tired eyes and the cautious bearing of someone who had learned to expect disappointment. "Father Mendez," she said carefully, not opening the door fully. "I was not expecting you, Maria. I apologize for coming unannounced. I was hoping we could talk. I believe I owe you an apology, and I would very much like to hear your story if you are willing to share it." Maria's expression softened slightly, but she remained guarded. "Father, you were very clear about my situation when I came to your church. I do not think there is anything more to discuss." Antonio took a deep breath, remembering the Pope's instruction to listen rather than lecture. "Maria, I was wrong. I responded to your request for communion without trying to understand who you are, or what brought you to seek God's presence again. I treated you like a canonical problem instead of a beloved child of God, and I am deeply sorry." The change in Maria's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her defensive posture relaxed, and tears began to form in her eyes. After a long moment, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Would you like to come in, Father? I can make coffee." Maria's apartment was small, but immaculately maintained, with religious images on the walls and children's toys scattered. Around the living room, a little girl, perhaps 4 years old, peeked shyly around the corner before running to hide behind her mother's legs. "This is Sophia," Maria said, gently encouraging her daughter to say hello. "Sophia, this is Father Antonio." From the church, as Maria prepared coffee, she began to tell her story without prompting, as if she had been waiting for someone to ask for months. She had been married at 18 to her high school boyfriend, a marriage that quickly became abusive. After years of trying to make it work, she had finally found the courage to leave when she discovered she was pregnant. "The church taught me that marriage was sacred, that divorce was wrong," Maria explained as she set coffee cups on the small kitchen table. "But staying was killing me, and I was afraid for my baby. I chose Sophia over doctrine, and I have never regretted that choice." Antonio listened without interruption as Maria continued her story. She had struggled as a single mother, working multiple jobs to support herself and Sophia 2 years ago. She had met Carlos, a kind man who worked as a mechanic and who treated both Maria and Sophia with gentleness and respect. "Carlos saved us," Maria said simply. "He helped me find stability, helped Sophia have a father figure, helped me remember what it felt like to be treated with love. We could not afford a church wedding, and my divorce was not recognized by the church anyway. So we had a civil ceremony." Maria paused in her narrative, looking directly at Antonio. "Father, I know the church teaches that I am living in sin. But I also know that God led me to Carlos, that our relationship has made me a better person and a better mother. How do I reconcile those truths? Antonio felt the weight of everything Pope Francis had told him. This was not a woman who was casually disregarding church teaching. This was someone who had made difficult choices in impossible circumstances, and who was genuinely seeking to live a faithful life within the limitations of her situation. Maria, Antonio said carefully, "Tell me why you decided to start coming to Mass again after being away from the church." Maria's eyes filled with tears. Sophia was diagnosed with leukemia 4 months ago. Doctors say her prognosis is good, but she needs extensive treatment. I found myself praying constantly, begging God to heal my daughter, promising him anything if he would save her. She wiped her eyes with a paper napkin. I realized that I had never stopped believing in God, even when I felt like the church had no place for me. I started attending your parish because I needed to be in God's house, needed to participate in the Mass again, needed to feel connected to something bigger than my fear for Sophia. Antonio felt his heart breaking for this woman who had been carrying such an enormous burden while he had focused only on her marital status. How is Sophia doing now? The treatment is working. The doctors are optimistic. Yeah, but Father, when I came to you asking for communion, it was because I wanted to thank God for saving my daughter. I wanted to participate fully in the Mass that had been sustaining me through the darkest period of my life. Maria looked down at her hands, wrapped around her coffee cup. When you turned me away, I felt like God was rejecting my gratitude. I felt like my prayers for Sophia did not matter because of my living situation. The words hit Antonio like physical blows. This woman had not been trying to circumvent church law or test his resolve. She had been trying to thank God for saving her child, and he had told her she was not worthy to approach the altar. "Maria," Antonio said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was completely wrong. Your love for Sophia, your gratitude to God, your desire to participate fully in the life of the church, these are signs of deep faith, not obstacles to communion." He paused, trying to find words for the transformation that Pope Francis had initiated in his understanding of ministry. "I want you to know that you and Sophia and Carlos are welcome in our parish family. Your complicated situation does not disqualify you from God's love or from full participation in our community." Maria looked up at him with surprise and hope. "Father, are you saying I can receive communion?" Antonio thought about Pope Francis's words about mercy preceding moral perfection, about meeting people where they are rather than where they should be. "Maria, I am saying that God sees your heart, your faithfulness, your love for your family, and your gratitude for his blessings. Those qualities matter more than canonical technicalities." For the first time since Antonio had arrived, Maria smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "Father, would you be willing to meet Carlos and Sophia properly? Would you consider blessing our family, even if our situation is not traditional?" Antonio felt something shift in his chest, a sense of purpose and joy that had been missing from his ministry for years. "Maria, I would be honored to know your family and to support you in whatever ways I can." 6 months later, Antonio stood at the altar of San Miguel Parish. But everything about his approach to ministry had fundamentally changed. The Sunday morning congregation looked the same as it always had, but Antonio now saw faces instead of categories, stories instead of compliance issues, opportunities for grace instead of potential problems to manage. Maria Santos sat in the third pew with Carlos and Sophia, no longer hiding in the back of the church, but participating fully. As valued members of the parish community, Sophia's hair had grown back completely after her successful treatment. Her bright smile had become one of Antonio's greatest sources of joy during Sunday services. The transformation in Antonio's ministry had not been without challenges. Some of his longtime parishioners had initially resisted his new emphasis on inclusion and mercy over rigid rule enforcement. A few families had even left to find a parish with a more traditional approach. But for every person who had left, 2 or 3 new families had joined. Drawn by word of mouth, reports of a priest who truly listened and welcomed people regardless of their circumstances, Antonio's homilies had evolved from doctrinal lectures into personal invitations to encounter God's love. His counseling sessions had shifted from providing definitive answers to walking alongside people as they struggled with difficult questions. His entire understanding of what it meant to be a successful priest had been revolutionized. The parish, now hosted monthly dinners for divorced Catholics, support groups for families dealing with addiction, and discussion sessions where people could voice their doubts and questions without fear of judgment. Antonio had discovered that when people felt safe to be authentic about their struggles, they were more likely to experience genuine spiritual growth. But the most significant change had been in Antonio himself. The man who had once derived security from absolute certainties now found peace in trusting God's grace to work through imperfect situations. The priest, who had once seen his role as protecting doctrine, now understood his calling as protecting people's capacity to encounter God's love. On this particular Sunday, Antonio was preparing to deliver a homily about the parable of the Good Samaritan. But his focus was not on the theological implications of the story. Instead, he wanted to challenge his congregation to consider how they responded to people whose life circumstances were messy, complicated, or difficult to categorize. As he began to speak, Antonio's eyes found Maria and her family. Sophia was coloring quietly while listening, and Carlos had his arm gently around Maria's shoulders. They looked like what they were, a family that had found healing and belonging in a community that had learned to see love where it had once seen only complications. "My dear friends," Antonio began, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent from his preaching for years, "today's gospel asks us a challenging question. When we encounter people who are wounded, struggling, or living in circumstances that make us uncomfortable, do we cross to the other side of the road, or do we stop to offer help?" He paused, thinking about his conversation with Pope Francis 6 months earlier, and how it had changed everything about his understanding of pastoral care. "I want to share with you a story about a time when I failed to be a good Samaritan. A woman came to our parish seeking to participate fully in the Mass, to receive communion as a way of thanking God for healing in her family. Instead of seeing her faith and gratitude, I saw only her complicated marital situation. I sent her away from the altar because I was more concerned with protecting rules than protecting her relationship with God." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Some parishioners had heard rumors about Antonio's changing approach, but this was the first time he had spoken so directly about his pastoral transformation. "That woman taught me something that changed my priesthood forever. She taught me that people do not come to church because their lives are perfect. They come because their lives are broken and they need healing. They come because they need to know that God loves them despite their mistakes, their struggles, and their complicated circumstances." Antonio looked directly at several families in the congregation who he knew were dealing with difficult situations. A teenager struggling with addiction, an elderly couple caring for a son with mental illness, a single father raising 3 children after his wife's death. The Good Samaritan did not ask the wounded man how he had ended up beaten and robbed. He did not require proof of worthiness before offering assistance. He saw someone in need and responded with compassion. This is the model Christ gives us for how we should treat each other and how we should understand our role as a faith community. After the service, Antonio was greeting parishioners at the church entrance when an elderly man named Roberto approached him. Roberto had been attending San Miguel parish for over 30 years and had initially been resistant to Antonio's new pastoral approach. Father Roberto said quietly, "I owe you an apology. When you started talking about mercy and inclusion, I thought you were abandoning church teaching. But I watched how you helped the Santos family, and I saw how much their faith grew when they felt truly welcomed. I think I understand now what you mean about mercy leading to holiness rather than replacing it." Antonio felt deeply moved by Roberto's words. The elderly man's acceptance meant a great deal because he represented the concerns of many longtime parishioners who had worried that compassion would somehow weaken their community's spiritual foundation. "Roberto, your questions and concerns helped me think more carefully about how to balance truth with love. And this journey has been a learning process for all of us." As the last parishioners left the church, Antonio found himself alone with Maria. Carlos and Sophia, the little girl, ran up to him with a drawing she had made during the service. A colorful picture of their family standing in front of the church with Antonio beside them. "This is our family with Father Antonio," Sophia announced proudly. "He helped Mama stop crying at night." Maria looked at Antonio with gratitude that went beyond words. "Father, you saved our family. It's not just by welcoming us back to the church, but by showing us that faith and real life do not have to be in conflict with each other. Carlos, who had initially been skeptical about involving the church in their lives, given Maria's previous experiences, stepped forward to shake Antonio's hand. "Father, thank you for showing us that there are priests who care more about love than about regulations. Sophia asks every week if we can invite you for dinner, and I want you to know that our home is always open to you." As Antonio walked back to the rectory later that afternoon, he reflected on the conversation with Pope Francis that had initiated this transformation. The Pope had been right about so many things, that certainty could become a form of pride, that mercy must precede moral instruction, that people needed to feel safe before they could grow in holiness. But perhaps the most important thing Pope Francis had shown him was that questioning his certainties did not weaken his faith. It deepened it. The priest who had once feared that admitting uncertainty would undermine his authority had discovered that vulnerability actually increased his ability to connect with and help the people he served. That evening, Antonio sat in his study writing a letter to Pope Francis, wanting to share how their conversation had transformed not only his ministry, but an entire parish community. He wanted the Holy Father to know that his words about shepherds going into the wilderness to find lost sheep had taken root in Argentina and were bearing fruit in ways that continued to surprise and inspire him as he sealed the envelope. Antonio said a prayer of gratitude for a pope who had been brave enough to challenge his certainties and wise enough to show him that love was not the enemy of truth, but its deepest expression. The man who had entered that cathedral 6 months ago, certain of his duty, had discovered a calling far more beautiful and demanding than anything he had previously imagined.